So BF doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but it has a very interesting origin story because BF actually stands for beautiful foolishness. It's a line out of the Book of T, and it's a statement about letting go of life's worries and relishing in the simple pleasures of simply being. One of the most fundamental lessons in art is to strip something down, to streamline it, to distill it to only its most essential parts. It's the essence of what we're trying to communicate. We've seen this in many art forms. We've seen this in sculpture, in writing, even in photography, and now we have it in a camera. But is it possible to go too far? To strip something down so much that it only ends up appealing to a select few? I really think that there's a fine line involved, and I think that Sigma may have crossed that line. I'm Chris Nichols, this is PetaPixel, and this is the Sigma BF. And so we find ourselves in my favorite city on earth, honestly, Tokyo, Japan. I always love coming here, and I really appreciate Sigma's flown us out here. They put us up in a really nice hotel to see their latest product launches, the 16-300, the 300-600, and of course, the Sigma BF. But as always, as much as we appreciate it, Sigma is not paying for this video. This is our opinions, this is our video, and they have no impact on what we say here. So we actually have been here for a few days. We're gonna stay for a few days more, but it's given me time to really get to grips with the Sigma BF, which I think you guys will realize is very important because we're talking about a radical shift in the sort of idea of this camera. But we also had a really nice journey with Sigma to Aizu, Japan. This is where the Sigma factory is, so we could see the factory tour, and that was really interesting.
It's Jordan here, and something you might not know about going on press events is huge swaths of time are taken up on a bus going from location to location, and that's the perfect time for me to get a little bit of editing done. But when I need a secure, reliable storage solution, I'm using the OWC Express 1M2. This is an enclosure with an 8 terabyte SSD in it, and what's really nice with this is it is passive cooling. There are absolutely no moving parts, unlike the bus that's driving me around right now. So this is bus powered, which means it doesn't require any external power supplies. And look at this USB-C port right here. It looks like every other USB, but this is actually capable of carrying Thunderbolt 4 or USB 4, which means incredibly fast data rates. It's available in several capacities, maxing out at this beautiful 8 terabytes I've got right here. So when we're out shooting around Tokyo, Chris can talk as much as he wants, and I'm not worried at all about storage. And I can edit any type of project on this drive with its maximum throughput of 3,151 megabytes per second. This thing is so fast, it's faster than this bus. Simply put, this SSD means busness.
No, stop it. No. Just click the link in the description below so this ad can be over, okay? No more of these bus jokes.
Thank you to OWC for sponsoring this episode.
So we had a lot of fun visiting Aizu. It was a neat part of Japan that we haven't seen before, and it did give me time to familiarize myself with this camera. But before I get into the controls and the handling, I think we have to first address just the radical change in the look of this camera. So I have the brushed aluminum finish one. There's also a black finish, but right off the bat, you can see this is very classy, very stylish and very simple. They have machined the Sigma BF out of a solid block of aluminum using 5-axis CNC machines. They're delivering like 9 of these a day at the factory because they're so intensive to actually machine in the first place, not even getting to the fact that you have to assemble them completely after that point. Now, it is no secret, I have been very vocal about my dislike for the ergonomics of previous Sigma cameras.
Holding this Quattro in my hand is like gripping onto a sea urchin tightly. Holding the grip, I feel like this constantly wants to fall to the left.
So when I saw the Sigma BF, I mean, of course, it is very striking in its appearance and it's a very different direction than they've normally gone, but it's actually quite comfortable to hold. When you have it in your hand, you've got this textured finish machined into the front of the camera where your hand will go. It actually does provide quite a solid purchase on the camera. The thumb rest is nice, but it's also comfortable and it does feel very secure. And the camera itself is around 380 grams, so it's really not very heavy at all. You know, looking over the body design here, they have rounded off some of the corners here on the bottom right, so it's comfortable for your hand, and here in the front left for when you're holding the lens. And that's a good thing because honestly, the other portions of this camera, the edges, are razor sharp, all right? I mean, Seth Miranda from Adorama TV pulled it out of his camera bag. It fell 3 inches, hit him in the forehead, and as you can see here, actually cut him open. So I mean, this is a beautiful and dangerous camera to hold, but when it's in hand, it's actually quite comfortable. Now, I will say that you only have one strap lug here, and it's on the right-hand side, so this is not really for a neck strap, unless it's one that's going to go around your neck and then just hang the camera here in a vertical position. I'm using it with just a very small wrist strap. They did not provide any, just so you guys know. That's why I'm using this here. But as I say, it's comfortable to hold in the hand when I'm shooting, but then when I'm walking around, especially with these heavier I-series lenses on the body, it's a little bit hard to hold on to unless you're comfortable just letting this beautiful work of art dangle. And so as I've mentioned before, this camera is stripped down and minimalistic to the most extreme degree, and I'm going to get into how the handling works and if I actually enjoy that experience. But I just want to mention about the only thing familiar about this camera from anything I've seen before is the fact that we still have a L-mount full-frame 24 megapixel sensor under here, basically very similar to what we would find on a Panasonic S5 II, for example. 24 megapixels with phase detect autofocus. That's the only thing that's familiar because this is a very strange design compared to anything we've seen before. Okay, so we're back. We're going to explore a little bit of Yokohama today. Beautiful location that I actually haven't been to before, so this is really nice. And you know, we've already talked about how the Sigma BF is a very stylish and sexy camera. Now, this is absolutely, as I mentioned, a minimalist approach. It's stripped down, and a lot of today's video is to be talking about what is not present on this camera, all right? I mean, yes, I do get that that is the idea. Again, this is designed to be kind of like a Leica where you have as little as possible between you and the photo taking experience. But what are we sacrificing? Well, the answer is yes. Okay, let's just get out of the way the thing that I always complain about on a lot of these new cameras, and that is that there is no EVF. Absolutely, complete lack of EVF, and I know that I'm old and I'm out of touch, and younger crowds maybe don't even mind that. I totally get that. So the back panel on the Sigma BF is a beautiful 2.1 million dot display. Very sharp, very clear. It does have a touchscreen capability, but we'll talk about that in a bit because it is quite limited. However, this screen, although very nicely integrated into the back of the body, does not tilt at all. There's no option to move it or to change it. And this represents a couple issues. First off, when you are using this camera at more acute angles, it's actually quite hard to see. It does go quite a bit darker. So if I'm doing low to the ground stuff and I'm trying to see my angle and compose with it, not being able to flip it out a little bit is quite difficult to compose with. Another issue is the brightness. I have the brightness on this thing cranked to the max, and then I've also turned on the additional automatic outdoor brightness setting to help me on days like today where we've got this really bright sun. And just to give you a real world situation for context, we were shooting Tsuruga Castle in Aizu Wakamatsu, and I mean, this is a torture test. Sunny day, white snow everywhere. You got light coming from below, light coming from above. So it's quite difficult to see, but even with things at the maximum brightness, it was very difficult to compose with. I couldn't really see my exposure. It's bright outside. I'm struggling to see the screen. Definitely struggling. People were out there with lens cloths over the cameras like it was a 4x5 large format, you know, to try to shade it to see this. And it would have been really nice to be able to tilt it out or change the angle or maybe even max out the brightness further. But of course, this is all detrimental to the overall battery life. And I really did find I was missing an EVF. Okay, Jordan, you won't believe what I just saw. Okay, I mean, we're at the Pacifico Center here for CP+, so you're seeing a lot of photographers around here, but I just saw somebody with a Nikon Coolpix 4500 Manfrotto 200PL plate on. He's got the ultra-wide adapter on the front. That's, I think, maybe even cooler than the Panasonic LX10 dude that I saw in Kyoto last year. It's crazy, incredible. So let's talk about buttons now on the camera, because this is actually quite a quick talk here. We've got actually a really nice, beautiful shutter mechanism, pressure sensitive, very comfortable to find and to use. We've got a large dial on the back. It's actually textured beautifully, so it's really easy to turn. And all of these controls, they actually give you a bit of haptic feedback, and when you turn the camera off, they lock in place. And this is nice because it prevents any sort of movement and wear and tear. Now that dial can also move as a joypad up, down, left, and right, and then you've got your main menu button as the middle button there. Otherwise, we've got playback, we've got another second dual layer menu button here right beside it, and then we have our on-off switch at the bottom. If I tap the on-off switch, it puts the camera into a sleep mode, which is nice. I can still see my battery life here on this little LCD display right at the back, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. And if I hold it down for a longer period of time, that shuts down the camera completely. Now, I was also actually really impressed by the on-off time on this camera. So, of course, I can't put it in sleep mode and then it's basically instantaneous if I need to shoot quickly. However, even just long pressing this on button actually turns on the camera very quickly. I'm ready to shoot pretty much right away before I would even get it into position. So that actually works really well. So this back screen here, I've got this little miniature LCD panel right above. This is very important to the operation of this camera because basically this is how it works. I push this center button here and I largely get a quick menu with 10 tiles. And then I can push up, down, left, and right to move my cursor around. And I've got everything here from file type, aspect ratio, focusing mode, color profile, exposure comp. Once I've highlighted something, I can then rotate the dial to manipulate that. I can do it right there on the screen or while I'm shooting. You'll remember the last thing that I chose. And again, this little LCD panel is critical to seeing what it is that I have selected last and what the value is as I change it. So I think Sigma's intention is to have a very simple interface. I mean, to the point where you might not even have any information on the screen, and you can certainly customize that. I've got it set right now so I can still see some of my system information, my color profile, what ISO set I'm using, aperture, shutter speed, and exposure compensation. But regardless, if I want to change a value, I can only do one at a time, and it's a little bit slow. I mean, whether I've got the information on the screen or not, or if I even go into the submenu or not, I still have to move the control pad left and right to toggle through all of these different options. So let's say that I'm changing my autofocusing mode, and then I want to go and I want to change my shutter speed, and then I want to change my ISO. It's this process of pushing right and left until I've highlighted the subject properly, and then using the dial to manipulate it. It's simple to understand, but in a quick situation where maybe I'm on the street and I want to get a photo really quickly, it's actually really slowing me down. Now this secondary menu button brings up features that I'm not going to change on the regular basis. So things like bringing up an electric level or having a display of my focal length or bringing up grids or a center mark for my focusing or doing things like being able just to see how many shots I have left remaining, what's the time on the clock in the camera, battery life, that kind of stuff. This is also where I can change monitor settings. And so this menu works well. I'm not going to go in here very often or customize a lot of stuff. But again, with so few buttons, it's strange that we have one button dedicated just to a menu that I'll never really use very often. I desperately wish I could customize it to do something else. We have a brand new battery type we've never seen before. Interesting design, kind of this vertical orientation. That's because it's along the side of the camera, which is right next to the lens mount. There's not a lot of space or real estate in this camera body to fit this kind of stuff. So it actually has really good capacity, but the actual battery life's not great. We're getting about 275 separated shots. You get a little bit more than that. That's just a little bit below average. But one thing I will say, when we were in Aizu, it was cold. I mean, it was snowy, but it wasn't that cold. Temperature's still above freezing. But I think with this battery just right next to this hard aluminum shell, which is just barely machined around it, the cold may have affected it, because I was watching my battery life drop quite quickly in those situations. Back here in nice warm Tokyo, it's lasting quite a bit longer. Now, the bottom of the plate, otherwise, it's very simple. We've got this rubberized finish, which is nice if you're gonna set this body down on a flat surface. We've got a standard 1/4 inch 20 tripod thread. There's actually a little detente register pin here, which is kind of cool. I guess there'd be a plate that you could put on there so that it won't twist, although that looks like it'd be fairly custom for this camera. The last thing I wanna say is, if you do put a tripod plate on this camera, it is gonna cover the battery switch. So you're not gonna be able to pop the battery out while it's got the plate on, and that's always a little bit inconvenient. Now, another thing that you're gonna find, well, you're not gonna find it because it's not on the side of the camera here, is any sort of memory card slot. And that's because the Sigma BF uses a very interesting internal SSD only for storage. We're looking at about 230 gigabytes, that's plenty. We're getting about 4,300 raw files roughly on that storage. And so that's actually really nice, because I can just plug a USB-C port here in the side. It's not only gonna charge the camera, but it's also gonna work as then the interface to copy files off of the SSD. But it works as a mass storage device. I can copy things onto this, I can copy things off of this. I mean, you can really do a lot of stuff with it. And I do like that it categorizes folders in your image folder by date and time. So every day that I shoot, I just get a separate folder, and that's actually really nice on a trip like this. And so look, I do really like having internal storage. I always think it's a great feature. I appreciate it on the Leica cameras, and Sigma certainly give us tons of storage on here, but maybe it's just the old man photographer in me, but I kind of wish I had some sort of backup just for peace of mind, like an SD card that I could throw in there. Even a micro SD card would be something that I could throw in there, because what that would give me is the option not only to have a backup if I need it. I mean, what if this SSD fails? Then this camera's going in for repair, but also just the ease of being able to pull a card out and then pop into an SD card reader and transfer files across. I do like that simplicity as well. Curiously though, this choice of just using the USB-C interface unfortunately means that there's no Wi-Fi, there's no Bluetooth, there's no way to use your phone to remotely fire the camera. There is a cable release that you can buy that will plug right into the USB-C port, and you don't have any mic jacks or headphone jacks, but you can again use the USB-C port to interface with things like microphones. But overall, it seems like a very limiting, very overly simplistic way of doing things. So you've got these beautiful pink blossoms, and I'm gonna do some macro shots here. I've got the Panasonic 100mm macro on here, which is a great lens for it, but I don't have any IBIS on the Sigma BF. So, I mean, there is an electronic shutter only, as I've said, and that does give you a bit of stability because there's no shake or anything like that, but I don't have any image stabilization in this lens. I don't have any in the body. I can't bring it up to my face to stabilize, so I gotta be very careful to be nice and stable, good hand position, and make sure that my shutter speed is fast enough to prevent any sort of motion blur. And so this is where I would really wanna look at getting lenses that have image stabilization to help out in a lot of situations. Unfortunately, as much as I love the I-series Sigma Prime lenses that match beautifully on this camera with its aluminum finish, none of those lenses have image stabilization in the lens. Now, I wasn't really surprised to find this, but of course we do not have any sort of mechanical shutter in the Sigma BF. It's completely dependent on electronic shutter, which of course means that we're gonna lose some bit depth. I mean, we're only gonna get 12-bit RAW files, so that hurts our DR a little bit. And of course, we're gonna get issues like rolling shutter. I'm sometimes gonna get a little bit of banding from all the artificial lighting. And so these are unfortunate things. And so I get why they wanna keep the mechanical shutter out of here. They're trying to make the camera as compact as possible, but a lot of these issues that we might have with banding and stuff, they'd largely be resolved if we had a faster scanning sensor, but we're basically getting the same 24 megapixel full frame sensor that we've seen in cameras like the Panasonic S5 II. And I like the image quality of that sensor, but again, rolling shutter, banding, these are things that we're gonna see. The one thing that I do like though is because there's no mechanical shutter, what Sigma has chosen to do is put a layer of optical glass well in front of the sensor. And I haven't seen this for a long time. This is a neat feature clear that we saw in a lot of older digital cameras. The nice thing there is if you get dust on that surface, it's not reaching the sensor itself, and then you don't really have issues as far as dust spots. Let's take a little bit of time just to talk about how this camera meters and handles as far as exposure goes, shall we? So it's a pretty simple interface, kind of like what you would see in a Fujifilm camera, where you don't have an official mode dial necessarily, but what you are doing is simply putting things like shutter speed to manual control or automatic control, aperture to manual control or automatic control, and by adjusting those two settings you can largely decide if you're in program mode, aperture priority, shutter priority, or full manual. The other thing I like here is we've got ISO, but it does have an auto ISO functionality, and there is an option to then go into the secondary menu. It's a little bit hidden, I have to admit, but go in there and I can actually set a minimum shutter speed that I want it to maintain, and that's something that I really like to have when I'm walking around town. I will say, if I can set it to auto ISO and then I have a lens with an actual aperture ring on it, this then negates the need to really go into that menu very often, and that speeds up the whole process. So that would be my ideal setup. So, you know, walking around here with the Sigma BF, I'm naturally reminded of my experience with the Leica TL, even though it's been a long time, for obvious reasons. I mean, both were machined beautifully out of aluminum billet stock, sharp edges, clean line, really simple interface, and the same kind of design aesthetic of having a camera that's limiting, simple, made for things like street photography, more casual shooters. And I actually really liked the Leica TL. I enjoyed that experience, although I think it's because it was largely thanks to a really thoughtful touchscreen interface, which kept things fun. This is a little bit different. I mean, the Sigma BF absolutely demands that you use this camera one way. You don't have any options to customize much. You don't have any options to change how the camera operates, how it focuses. You know, all this kind of stuff is very rigid. And so, although I'm finding that same design aesthetic of limitation, I'm finding this a little bit more stifling. Okay, here's something I'm really impressed by and I actually really wasn't expecting. So first off, this camera has the ability to shoot fairly basic autofocusing capabilities. I can go autofocus single point, autofocus continuous, and I can do just a center point or a wide area. But it also does have eye detect and animal detect. And this will let you shoot up to 8 frames per second with full continuous autofocus. Doing the Jordan running test here with the 90mm at f2.8, you can see it actually did a really good job following and tracking him. Now for Jordan's running test, I was using wide area with eye detect to let the camera just track him and follow him, you know, using subject detection. But what I also really appreciate is when using a single point, I can just touch anywhere on an object, and actually the autofocusing tracking is really good even if there's no subject detected, just like inanimate objects. And it really does remind me a lot of Sony's real-time tracking autofocus. And then this is further interesting because when we did our interview with the CEO of Sigma, Kazuto Yamaki-san, he hinted on wanting to make a camera that's clearly more aimed at the enthusiast. I mean, this is for the street photographer, this is for the casual user, you know, something stylish on the shoulder, but he implied that he wants to make a camera that works with more telephoto lenses, larger optics, to do things like wildlife, sports, and action. And if the autofocus performs like this does, I could see a lot of potential there. So let's talk about image quality here. I mean, I've already mentioned that we're not going to be getting any 14-bit RAW files with the electronic shutters, so we lose a bit of DR, but image quality is still really nice. And actually, what I was most impressed by was the color modes on the Sigma BF. The first thing I'll say, all companies put different art filters and different color profiles, but what I like about the Sigma BF is that I don't have 40 of them to go through. I mean, it's a fairly limited selection. They're actually all quite stylish. I like the look of them. I also like the fact that monochrome is at the very end, so I can just jog the wheel really quickly all the way to the right and I'll eventually end up in black and white without having to look. I like that. And I can go into each profile and customize them for contrast, color, hue, warmth, all that kind of stuff. That being said, I just think right out of the box they look really stylish and really nice, and I've been endeavoring to use them quite a bit. Now, of course, I can shoot RAW plus JPEG, and the Sigma BF gives me DNGs, and I do always like that because if I want a RAW file that I can open up in anything, DNG is the best way to go. So you might be sitting at home thinking, okay, well, the Sigma BF, it's this minimal, it's this simplistic. They've probably just eschewed video altogether, and I would totally understand if that's what you're assuming, but turns out this does shoot video. So let's go to Jordan. He's going to talk about that next.
All right, it's Jordan here to once again remind you, always film on location, you cowards. And I'm doing that today, recording with the Sigma BF in 6K with the L-log profile, which is really interesting. This is actually Leica's log profile now available for Sigma cameras, we're seeing all kinds of advantages of this L-mount alliance. Now, the previous Sigma FPs were very video-oriented cameras. They were actually capable of recording internal raw video, and I would say the recording modes are just a lot more accessible on this. If scaled down a little bit, we can record H.264 and H.265, as I mentioned, up to 6K recording. Slow motion, though, is just going to be a 1080p affair, up to 120 frames per second. Now, I bring up the Sigma FP because one thing that camera actually did quite well is I thought it had a very intuitive video interface, but I do find, as Chris has already mentioned, having to scroll through every setting that I want individually is very time consuming, especially when you're trying to set up some of your monitoring tools. This is quite interesting because we've got a histogram and we have false color as well as zebras for metering your scene, but it does take a while to get to them, and frustratingly, you can't use just the touch screen or just the control dial. You have to use a combination of the two, and you're never actually sure which one you should be using at a given point to select the tools that you want to use. Now, Chris has already talked about the lack of IBIS, but I'd say that's even a bigger issue when you're recording in video mode, because this does have quite a bit of rolling shutter, similar to what we've seen on a lot of the other 24 megapixel full frame cameras. And you can see when I'm trying to get grab shots, which is what I would really think this camera excels at, that rolling shutter, that bounciness is definitely accentuated. Now, there is the option to apply digital stabilization to this, which does incur a bit of a crop, but doesn't help you with that rolling shutter effect, so it still looks wonky. Now, Chris already talked about the lack of ports in this camera. That extends to their video inputs as well. There is no microphone jack, no headphone jack. You can plug a microphone theoretically into the USB-C port on this. There's a menu option for it. The camera says you have connected a microphone, but unfortunately we couldn't actually get any audio signal into the camera using multiple different receivers. Now, I'm gonna give it to Sigma here because the autofocus improvement in the BF coming from the earlier FPs is probably the biggest single generation video autofocus jump I've seen. It's actually quite responsive. It does have some quirks though. I found it actually sticks to subjects better when I half press the shutter, but you can see when I was following Chris around in very low light, it actually did a really nice job of sticking with him. Like most other video cameras, this will get confused if there's really busy scenes or very low contrast, but overall, I mean, bravo Sigma. This is a massive improvement and actually a pretty good autofocus system. So the Sigma is interesting because it's oddly capable at some things. I mean, yes, you are getting good video quality on this. The autofocus really surprised me, and we've got nice assist tools like having shutter angle, false color that make you think a very professional camera. But at the same point, it seems very confused because the lack of image stabilization, the lack of any way to get usable audio into this camera that we've found so far means it's only really going to be useful for occasional grab shots. And at $2,000, there are tons of very competitive options, even in L-mount, where you could look at something like the Lumix S5 II for less money. But if you do grab a BF because you want a beautiful photo camera, rest assured you can get some decent quality video out of it.
You know, if there's a camera design company that can just take the idea of a camera, like a very abstract concept, then just doggedly stick to it and distill it down until you're left with a camera, it is Sigma. I mean, you got to respect it. Takes some boldness to just say, this is what I want to make. It doesn't matter what anybody else wants. This is what we're going to do. And then they do it. But I don't think that necessarily guarantees that what you're going to be left with is a great camera. This actually reminds me a lot of the Sigma DP Merrill cameras, where you had something that had a lot of limitations, a very strange design structure, and was made for a very specific purpose. But at the same time, I feel like the Sigma DP Merrills with those foveon sensors give you very unique image quality that you would not get anywhere else. Whereas here now we're getting image quality which is the same as what we've seen before. That means that the design has to be that much more important to the actual end user. The Sigma BF is very much a curated artistic experience, and it is very limiting. And I mean, don't get me wrong, limitations can actually be a lot of fun. Sometimes it'll just simplify things so that your mind can simply focus on taking nice images. Or sometimes it can be a very specialized tool which might not be very versatile, but is good for one thing specifically. But the Sigma BF itself, I feel, is very simple. I think too simple, and I did find myself wanting more. And maybe that's because I come from a background where I'm used to having more controls on a camera. I just feel like the audience here is going to be very limited. You know, this is for somebody who wants, first off, a very beautiful looking camera with a very striking design, you know, around the shoulder, going out for a casual day, just taking nice images here and there, and not having to worry too much about having a ton of control. But at the same time, there's so many situations where, although I have manual control here, it wasn't just that it was simple or limiting, but that it was actually a little bit slow to use or a little bit cumbersome to manipulate. And that's where I found myself not necessarily enjoying the experience as much as I could have. I suppose if I'd never used another camera, you know, if I was coming from a smartphone as a new photographer, this might be an interesting aspect. Or if it absolutely just seemed to fit exactly the limited scope of what I wanted out of a camera, then I could see this experience being really fun. But I hope you guys understand what I'm getting at here with my experience on it. So last year we were in Osaka, Japan. We were testing the Panasonic S9. I think it's very natural to compare these two cameras against each other because they're very compact. They're full frame cameras, 24 megapixels. They lack mechanical shutters. You know, they're quite small. They're designed to be stylish and fun to use. And I did criticize the Panasonic S9, rightfully so, for missing a lot of what I considered important features. I mean, that thing didn't have a hot shoe, it just had a basic cold shoe. But then look, the BF has nothing at all. There's no way to mount anything to it. The S9 lacked a mechanical shutter, so does this. But the S9 would give you things like IBIS, whereas we don't have IBIS here. The Panasonic S9 gave us mic jacks, and it gave us the ability to customize the camera the way that we want it to, whereas this forces you into a really rigid way of shooting. And look, when I was using the Panasonic S9, it was not a camera made for me. It wasn't the kind of camera that I'd want to pick up. It had a lot of limitations that I found quite frustrating, but those similar limitations are present here. Ultimately, though, I found the Panasonic S9 to be a more enjoyable shooting experience overall than the Sigma BF, and I think that's because it gave me a lot of features that I could blissfully ignore rather than having a very limited, very rigid way of shooting with features that maybe occasionally would bring me moments of bliss. So look, I get that Sigma loves making cameras exactly the way they want to make them, and I totally respect that. They're just not often for me. I also get that there's going to be, in my opinion, a fairly small group of people that will absolutely adore this camera. They'll covet it, they'll want to have it, and they'll enjoy using it. And there's certainly fun to be had using this camera. At the same time, I do think value for the dollar is just not there. I mean, for the same amount of money, you can get many other platforms that will give you far more capability. And even something like the Panasonic S9, which is far more affordable, I feel gives you a lot more usability and a lot more versatility. Although again, I get that is kind of missing the point. So there is no denying that the Sigma BF is a beautiful camera, but it may also be a little bit foolish. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed our trip here to Tokyo, Japan. Again, thanks to Sigma for letting us have the opportunity to try this camera. It was a lot of fun. CP Plus was really enjoyable to see as well. And I hope our video helps you guys decide if this camera is something that would interest you, or perhaps this is not made for you. So let us know in the comments below what you think. Definitely talk to us on the PetaPixel podcast. We love having that feedback, and you can watch that right here on this channel or listen to it on all your favorite podcasting apps. And do consider while you're at it, exploring PetaPixel.com with a PetaPixel membership. That way you get ads-free viewing, you get discounts on the merch store, and you also get the option to look at all of our sample galleries and download the raw files, including the Sigma BF files. So definitely check that out. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you soon with more on PetaPixel.